With that, I think I invite Raniya Sobir. Raniya is from Maldives, and she's going to be talking today, assessing and knowing what works in climate change adaptation. Raniya, in view of the time that we're in, if you could, to the extent possible, do a little, speed up your presentation. And we also need to have time. I would much rather have more time for question and answers. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. So to start with, as we've discussed yesterday as well, climate change is one of the biggest development challenges that we are facing today. It affects the poorest countries in the world, because these countries, their economies and people depend on the natural resources which get impacted from climate change. And within these countries, it is the poorest sections of the society or population who are going to be affected by climate change. Because, again, their jobs, their income, their assets depend on these resources which are going to be impacted by this phenomenon. And they're the people with the least coping strategies, the least political voice and representation. So I think it's very interesting that we brought this question. I think it was Dennis yesterday who mentioned whether we can even separate out climate change and development. So looking at climate change interventions, there are two types of interventions. Mitigation, which tackles causes of climate change. So it looks at mostly reducing carbon emissions. You must have heard of green growth strategies. And then we look at adaptation, tackling the effects of climate change. How do we adapt to these changes that are taking place? IPCC, this is a official definition of adaptation. And adaptation interventions usually, look at a broad range of sectors, looking at food security, access to water, public health, coastal infrastructure, livelihoods, climate forecasting, community-based disaster risk reduction, early warning systems, insurance. So this adaptation looks at a broad range of areas. And to understand adaptation, I think we should also look at two other concepts, which is vulnerability, degree to which populations face harm from climate change. And again, if you look at vulnerability, it is again the poorest groups who face the highest vulnerabilities. And this vulnerability is not just related to, directly to climate effects, but also the other socioeconomic, institutional factors matter. And then the other sort of concept that we look at in adaptation is the adaptive capacity, ability of human systems to adapt to and cope with climate change. And those factors include wealth, technology, education, information, skills, infrastructure. So all these things which are non-climate related, which makes it more interesting. And there's also this concept of resilience, which I think Bruce is going to look at this afternoon. And again, that is linked to vulnerability, and I think we've also come across this in yesterday's presentations. So looking at the adaptation continuum, there are two aspects. One is that activities are looking at, like I said, reducing non-climate related, impact, or reducing, poverty and increasing incomes and building, coping strategies. And the other side looks at, addressing directly the impacts of climate change, managing the climate variability and actually confronting climate change. So there are, within adaptation, you also have these two different aspects, looking at the adaptation deficit and looking at the adaptation gap. So now comes to the topic of the presentation. Why M&E of adaptation? And again, why adaptation? So I'll be asking why M&E and why adaptation? So the first question, I think we have dealt with this in the past 2 days. Why M&E? So I think there's a lot of interest in adaptation now. Addressing climate change historically has been very much focused on mitigation strategies, but now there's renewed focus to actually, sort of leverage investments in adaptation, and it's a new area. So there's a lot of investments coming from donors, into adaptation. So I think this is why we should be looking at M&E of adaptation. And this looks at two areas, which again we have discussed in detail. Are we looking at accountability? Are we looking at learning? Accountability in the sense, are we achieving the things that we set out to do in adaptation interventions? Are we able to do the projects or achieve what we have sort of intended to do? And then the other part is the learning part. What have we achieved? Is it working? What can we scale up? What can we replicate? Where is the evidence? Can we build the evidence for justification for future investments in climate change adaptation? So these are the two areas why we should be looking at monitoring and evaluation of adaptation. I think in our yesterday's workshop, we actually talked about whether these are two conflicting objectives, or whether they. So would like to hear your views as well, because we've dealt with these two purposes separately. On one hand, we're trying to report that we've completed our objectives, we've completed our project on time. But then, are we going beyond to actually look at what have we achieved, and whether these interventions actually work? Is there something new that we need to do? So, any views? I think it was Carol yesterday who said that the two objectives actually, it doesn't conflict with each other. If you're trying to know that you've achieved objectives that you set out to do, that will also give you the evidence base for learning and scaling up. So, and then we ask why are we looking at adaptation specifically? As I've said before, it's a new and unexplored area. There's new interest in adaptation because of increasing climate change impacts. Before it was more on mitigation or preventing changes of this phenomenon, but now it's actually about confronting and facing this reality. So most adaptation projects, policies and programs are either under development, under implementation, and only a few have been concluded. So this is where it gets interesting. It's a new and unexplored area, so we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about what actually works. Then we have the diversity factor. As I've said before, adaptation looks at a range of areas, from health to infrastructure to gender issues, youth issues, agriculture. So, and it involves a range of practitioners. We're looking at a mix of scientists, project managers, farmers, doctors. So I think that's again an area. The diversity factor makes adaptation more complex. Looking at M&E of adaptation becomes more complex. Then we look at the context. Adaptation depends heavily on the context. Climate change risks linked with other challenges facing communities, which cannot be addressed in isolation. The socio-economic environment, political environment, technology, all these other factors. So this is again a reason why we should look at adaptation. So then I'll move on to some of the challenges. I don't know if anyone want to comment in between. Should just go on. When doing monitoring and evaluation of climate change adaptation, first challenge is time frame. M&E systems will need to track success or failure in the short term, medium term, long term, because we are looking at a very broad time horizon when it comes to climate change. And adaptation, the impact of adaptation has to be looked over a long period of time. So that makes it challenging in terms of building M&E systems. Then you also have the issue of trade-off, between the short term and the long term. If rainfall is falling, rainfall issues are there. You might want, in the short term, you might build, irrigation systems. But then, in the long term, when climates dry up and there's these irrigation systems can actually affect unsustainable, water use. So there are these conflicting objectives in terms of adaptation as well, or trade-offs that we should be careful about. And the high degree of uncertainty, how and when will climate change actually occur? And how would human and natural systems shift in response? What factors will most influence vulnerability over time? We have, the climate, it's a changing environment, and so we have a moving target. So how do you account for that in M&E systems? So it's impossible to simply measure adaptation progress towards a known future climatic state in this environment of uncertainty. Then we come to defining adaptation effectiveness. If you're building an M&E system, what do you have as your targets? As what is successful, or what is it that we should achieve as successful adaptation? Because it's relatively a new topic, and because of the broad range of interventions, there's no common agreement or understanding of success sort of agreed benchmarks that we can really use in M&E systems. And the counterfactual scenario for impact evaluations, for example, gets complicated because counterfactuals looks at what might have happened if you didn't do an intervention, and in an environment of uncertainty, the attribution gets even more complicated. We looked at attribution in counterfactual scenarios, but in adaptation, given the uncertainty environment, it gets even more complicated. And again, it's a very, adaptation interventions are very complex because, as I've said before, these interventions go across many sectors, and you're dealing with, a range of institutions from community to policymakers to all kinds of professionals. So it involves a range of targets, indicators, benchmarks. That poses, challenges for actually building good M&E systems for adaptation. The data gap, as it's a new area. Again, do we have the appropriate data? What are the potential data availability that's going to be there in the future? How representative is this data, and are they going to be available over this longer period of time that we are looking at? So again, these are some of the challenges that we have to address. Now we come to my favorite bit. So I get to talk about my country. 80% of the country lies within 1.5 meters of altitude. So it's one of the lowest lying countries in the world. We have 350,000 people living across 200 islands. And the capital is where a third of the people live. It's just 2 square kilometers, very densely populated. And physically, it's the most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. Looking at the scenario of climate change in Maldives, the impact, looks at beach erosion, damage to infrastructure, high frequency of low impact hydrometeorological disasters, basically extreme weather patterns. We're seeing increasingly a lot of coastal flooding, storm surges, which we have not experienced in the past. So one of my colleagues in Maldives, he described adaptation as it's all about being able to live, earn, and prosper without any reversal in the face of climate risks. So in the Maldives, looking at adaptation priorities, we have a NAPA document, which is the policy document outlining the kind of priorities that are there. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a M&E framework, and it's not monitored at all. One of the priority areas for adaptation is drainage and water management. The second and most important or immediate priority is coastal protection. This shows a sort of a survey recently done on islands, reporting severe coastal erosion. You can see between 1970 and 1980, only one island had experienced severe erosion. And then the survey was done across 40 islands, and you can see between 2000 and 2010, the number of islands reporting severe erosion has actually increased. So coastal protection is one of the priorities of adaptation. Then tourism. 30% of our GDP directly counts for tourism. 90% indirectly. So the whole economy basically is made up of tourism. So protecting this industry is very important. So tourism adaptation is a major priority. So this is again a survey done to get perceptions from the industry in the face of climate change. How is it going to affect our main economic activity? So you can see some of them are saying that the resorts or the hotels, which are actually based on separate islands. So we have 100 hotels, each of them on one island only, and then physically separate from islands where people live. So you can the industry sees some of these islands actually submerging. Yes, and then some of them predict obviously a reduction in tourist arrivals. You can see damage to physical infrastructure, damage to the natural environment, especially the marine environment. A lot of the tourists who come to Maldives, they come for diving, and then there are other factors. So protecting this industry is a major priority in terms of adaptation. And we've talked about this factor of uncertainty, tackling uncertainty. And I get this question all the time: is Maldives really sinking? And I hate the question, but and this is interesting because when you, as a person who lives there, it doesn't strike you, or it doesn't. You don't live with this question all the time. Is it really sinking? Because we have other priorities: the local communities, even the development practitioners, NGOs, even the people who work in the government. We have all these other priorities. So when you are trying to build, adaptation, and when you're trying to build M&E systems, this uncertainty becomes even more complex at the national level or at the local level. But if you're a development professional who's, who doesn't belong to this kind of setting, you become more objective, I think. You have the data, you have the evidence, and it's easier. But for someone who's actually living there, to comprehend this scenario, it's very difficult. And that uncertainty, actually could affect the way you I don't know, design or prioritize M&E. So these are some of the projections, from IPCC. And some more projections, localized projections again from IPCC. If you look at temperatures and rainfall, second diagram looks at central Maldives experiencing very high extreme rainfall between 2021, 2050, and 2082. And these are again projections. So how do you build M&E systems, or how do you build adaptation based on these projections? The uncertainty factor is very complex. And I live in the central regions. Trade-offs, we've talked about trade-offs again, short-term versus long-term. So in Maldives, when coastal erosion starts happening, people build seawalls, and they use all kinds of, moving garbage or these kind of sandbags, all kinds of, concrete seawalls. And it's been done, there's a lot of money invested in building seawalls, and it's been done, in all kinds of ways. And sometimes this is actually more detrimental because, it sort of damages the coastal, the reef systems. And it has actually, now we are seeing that it's actually, these kind of seawalls that were done in the 80s have sort of impacted on the islands physically. And we are seeing more erosion because of these kind of interventions. So immediate sort of adaptation, this might have been an immediate adaptation intervention, but then it's actually, in the long term, we are seeing more negative impacts. So how do you measure, within an M&E system, these kind of trade-offs? Data and baseline gaps. You would imagine one of the countries being that is most vulnerable to climate change, we would have good data, or we would have assistance of international support in this area, but no. The reporting is very ad hoc. Islands report erosion, or we have severe erosion, we have some erosion. There's no standards. Water shortage, when the actual water shortages start happening, they just call us and say, send us water. So these are the kind of data that the Ministry of Environment actually keeps. There's no systematic data. Coastal protection, only 2011 they have done a study. Tourism adaptation, there's some data on perception, which I've shared. So there's really no systematic data collection. So when people ask, is Maldives really thinking, we actually don't have, concrete data or information to support these kind of statements, unfortunately. Then we talked about, what is successful adaptation, or what are the sort of targets.
Would you, sorry to interrupt, would you skip to the indicators or the M&E part? Because we're really, I know we're sorry to cut you a bit short.
Yeah.
Would you skip to that part for us?
Okay.
And we can get people can download this and look at the details of adaptation off the internet.
Okay. Yeah. So basically the point here is that we have traditional adaptation sort of options which seem to have actually been quite good. And so how do you build that local knowledge in defining successful adaptation, defining good targets? That was the point I was trying to make. And then processes, looking at political environments, changing priorities, within an M&E system, what are the socio-economic dynamics? For example, we had the tsunami. In a matter of seconds, 62% of the GDP, that was the damage that the country faced. But because the tourism sector bounced back, we were able to recover. Now, looking at M&E in the Maldives, I talked to a colleague in UNDP, because they basically manage the biggest environment portfolio, and a colleague in the Ministry of Environment. UNDP says systems for M&E is missing in the government, and there's no interest or demand for M&E. From the government side, they say, oh, we just report, there's only compliance-based. No one really monitors results. And I think we have discussed this in the past 2 days as well. And then he said, reporting is a nightmare. I have 5, 6 donors to report to. They all have different formats. They're all looking at different indicators. And then there's this constant debate about misalignment as well, between what the government wants donors to support and what donors want. So a lot of donors are actually interested in the soft aspects, capacity building, technical assistance, whereas the government wants infrastructure and, for example, coastal protection. It says, what other option is there? So these kind of conflicts are there. So in terms of monitoring as well, for them, there is no real incentive to look at a successful adaptation because of this kind of conflicting debates in terms of programming itself. So I think this is, again, an interesting question we sort of dwelled on. Why is it that there's no interest in M&E? And how do you incentivize, or how do you get governments and sort of local groups to actually participate in M&E and build their capacity? Now, issues with current approaches, again, this is more different from the other sectors that we've looked at. Most of the M&E for adaptation has very deterministic approaches, looking at what are we going to achieve, basically, rather than how we have achieved or why, looking at the process. It's all input output based rather than the process-based sort of approaches. And again, how do you take into account the moving targets, the long term, the time frame? Most of the M&E frameworks that exist, they're very fixed. They don't look at this dynamic environment in which the programming is done. And there's lack of focus on learning and on how adaptation and adaptive capacity lives. So some of the early lessons which were noted in some of the reports: design for learning, design M&E systems for learning. Within that, the accountability will be sort of taken care of. And manage for results, go beyond the typical output, completed these activities to actually what have we achieved, what is the outcome, or what is the impact of these interventions. Maintain flexibility, change and adapt along the way. So these are some of the methodologies, and I think the CCH report will be looking at these methodologies, so I think I'll just skip these. Just to note some of the best practices, if you're doing adaptation M&E, you should start collecting baseline data. It's a new area. These are the kind of data that would be important. And what are the alternatives to absence of baseline data? If you don't have baseline data, maybe you can compare, if you're trying to evaluate a project, you can maybe compare to the project context or the area, and then compare it to an area where adaptation has not been done. So that's one way of basically addressing the baseline data gap. And you can start, collecting most critical data as soon as implementation begins. Even if you don't have, baseline data, you can sort of prioritize it. Start collecting the important data that you need. And look for existing statistics. I think this is very important, and because even in motives, there's a lot of information collected all over the there's no information sharing, there's no systematic management of data. Use of technology, I think we've not really looked at this, but to address some of the challenges in MME, I think we should look at basically how technology can actually address some of these issues that we talked about. And this again, we've talked about choose a dynamic and process-oriented approach, make it participatory, encourage self-evaluation, encourage learning by doing, rather than the typical fixed approaches. And impact evaluation.
I'm sorry, could we perhaps take some questions? Because you've got a huge amount of information there.
Yeah, this is last
It's
one.
really
slide.
fantastic, but maybe we open it up for questions.
Okay, this is last point.
And we
Last
all want to come to the Maldives, I know that.
So yeah, just the last slide. The last point is basically, impact evaluations. If your project gets completed, is it necessary for you to do an evaluation? We should leave it basically optional. And these are some of the criteria or questions that you should ask before doing an evaluation. Not every project has to be evaluated. This is the last point.
My apologies for skipping you through quite a few of your slides, so sorry for that, Raniya. But I think that there's an opportunity to get people to ask M&E questions. If there are any M&E questions about one of the things you said about how do you get government interested and how do you deal with all of the different approaches or requests by different donors. I think there are two critical things for M&E in terms of climate change and adaptation in the Maldives. Were there any particular questions that people wanted answered? We'll take 3 questions and then we'll break for coffee and for tea.
Thank you, Raniya, for the presentation. And climate change is one of my favorite topics because it really clearly points out how human can be self-destructing. And the whole political economy of development is also manifested in disasters. My first comment is about the immediate of adaptation, as you say. We have been trying out different types of processes, and in the last slide you have been showing that this participatory process, dynamic process. So probably a lot depends what we have been trying in our country as well, in our programs as well, is that first of all, if you focus mostly on short-term projects, then I don't think it's going to have a real climate change adaptation processes. So probably, I understand donors will not give funds for long term, but at least if when we develop a project, if it is a long-term vision, but a short-term projects, then probably it will bring some results. And it has an implication of monitoring as well. Because when you're developing projects and the indicators, probably if you have a long-term planning, then probably it will be work. And we have some examples for that as well. And in the process also, we are trying some participatory processes like group formation and where the community itself has some sort of monitoring mechanisms within themselves. So they can also measure what's their change and not necessarily talking only of climate variability, but climate change. So this type of process we are doing, and probably that can answer some sort of monitoring indicators on something. Another thing that we have been struggling is to come up with indicators. Because when we try to come up with climate indicators, which you rightly pointed out, it cuts across different sectors. So it's very difficult to have specific climate indicators, whether it cuts such as water sanitation, agriculture, and other so many so forth. So therefore, we are still not clear whether you have an experience how we can really have some climate indicators, or it should be looked upon from the overall development perspective, other indicators as well. So probably that I would love to know. Another thing that I also raised in that day to Ali is that the problem that we have been facing in our country is that when it comes to climate change, climate adaptation, and there is a big fight between the scientific people and the local community. And there are lots of research organizations, even the government, even the donors, they are mostly focusing on the scientific community's knowledge, totally forgetting the local community, local knowledge at all. So probably it's a very important process that should have in a bottom-up process, so that there is a good evidences, documentation evidences, which will really feed into the discourse, climate change discourse. And to take from there, probably it would be good to have the international negotiations that's going on. Maybe in Maldives experience, I don't know, in Bangladesh experiences, when a government is going to international negotiations like COP and everything, civil society is very closely associated with government. And the civil society voice there is very much based on the evidence at the grassroots level. So it helps a government to do a negotiations which are evidence-based, grounded. So I think that's something that maybe there's some experience in Maldives, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Dennis, would you like to comment? Are there any model frameworks for countries for climate change that look at all sectors and assist countries like the Maldives and Pakistan and so on develop their own frameworks? Is there any common framework for a country?
It's not that there is one common framework that works for all. There are some frameworks that are multi-sectoral, multi-level. The UNDP one is one that is already quite old. It's used the first time in 2007. And that looks at 6 sectors, and it looks at 5 types of activities, including policy development. So that's very applicable also on the government level. The downside of that one is that what you see quite often in multilateral organizations, it never became more than a draft version, but it is used in UNDP projects. So there is some experience with the use of that one. One thing that's true is that there's a big disconnect between the academic world and the frameworks developed by them and the usefulness of these frameworks on the ground. And that's something that needs to be addressed over the coming years. The downside is that we are moving faster and faster into new directions while we haven't come to grips with the basics yet. So a few years ago it was all about adaptation, adaptive capacity, and now it's all about resilience, and every academic is talking about resilience. But the problem is that the average implementing organization still doesn't really have an idea how to measure their adaptation.
And the academics sometimes go around in ever-decreasing smaller circles, speaking from experience. Excuse me.
I think it's very interesting the topic you bring about, especially in the Indonesia context. We have 17,000 islands, but maybe in the next 20 years, maybe only 7 or 8 islands, maybe. So what we are doing that in Indonesia, I mean, you have all this national policy, but not in particular for adaptation, but climate change in general. But because of the political context, it's a decentralized country. All the districts didn't really follow the national policy or national guideline. So what their projects, what they are doing is on how the local government themselves can have in the planning and the budgeting on how to prevent the climate change. So for example, like in the budgeting, in the local budgeting, they put in the all sectors on how they can, for example, provide awareness to the communities. Yeah? And then in some technical aspect, they have to put the budget because that's I think the indicator that people can see, and the stakeholders also agreed that if you want to look at that climate change being addressed, is you look at in the planning and budgeting, because that's what is there, you know, it's going to be implemented. Otherwise, and what are the motivation of the government? Because at the local level is the executive and also the parliament members. But the motivations are, people are not going to elect them if they have no planning and budgeting to address all the people's issues, you see, because they were elected by the community in large.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question for Raniya, I would love you to address her in the tea and coffee break. So Raniya, thank you very, very, very much, and we all want to come and visit you in the Maldives. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm cutting this short because we've had 2 very detailed and very interesting presentations, but we're well over time. So come and have tea and coffee, and ask Jeffrey or ask Raniya questions about monitoring and evaluation, and stretch your legs. And I've just had the air conditioning turned off too, if you're feeling cold. You can